Well, I have to say, working through this text, this is probably one of the most funny narratives I have ever worked through. It is beautiful what the Lord does. But when we think about the setting of this narrative and the story of this narrative, we have to remember the predicament that Esther is in. We've learned that when Persia makes a decree, that decree is set in stone. So you would think the obvious thing would be for Esther to take the decree, ask for up to half the kingdom, and basically settle God's people, right? That would be a way for the Lord to be faithful to his promise and to also allow for this decree to have some wiggle room. And this is where I marvel at the providence of God. That's not at all what he does. Because that again would show that God has to sort of work with man and God's not really sovereign. And we find that in terms of what Esther is also up against, not only the Persian decree, but this notion that there's another decree. So there's two decrees she's trying to work into context. On the one hand, the wives are not supposed to disrespect their husband. That's the first decree we learn about in the book. And secondly, that the Jews will be exterminated in 11 months. So Esther cannot just go and try and rule the roost and dominate her husband, because there's been a decree against that. She also is one who understands she's working on a timeline, and it's a real timeline. It's not fake. That there is about to be a heinous mass genocide against the Jewish people, who literally mean descendants of Judah. That's what Jew means. Descendants of Judah. Which means the messianic line is about to be exterminated. And so when we look at this, we say, well, how is the Lord possibly going to overcome this? We've seen a burning bush. We've seen 10 plagues. We've seen remarkable, miraculous accounts of deliverance in terms of Daniel and his friends when they're in exile. Is that what the Lord's going to do? But we see that the Lord has an incredible sense of humor. And so when we ask that question, how is the Lord going to save his people, maintain his promises, and show that the decrees of Persia do not veto the decrees of heaven? How can we be assured of that? Right? I'm sure many times we read the news, we can think the same thing. When we look at this, we'll see first there's a providential problem. We'll see secondly, there's a king's query where he's asking a question. And last, we find Haman's horror, which becomes rather entertaining for us, and it is rather tragic to see what happens. But in terms of beginning with the providential problem, that the text tells us that we're setting between two feasts, right? So this is a setting of the scene. You have the end of chapter 5 where Haman has been elevated. He's exalted. He's been with the king. He's with the queen. He's one of the main guys in the empire. No one else is there, right? And he's bragging about this to his family to the point where we're just like, good night. Nobody's this important, all right, Haman? Just back off. And he's got this plan that was hatched the day before that, listen, this is what you do. You got the biggest gallows, you set it up, and you make sure Mordecai is impaled on this thing. So that's literally what it means, is a tree. So the reason why this is built so quickly, you find a really tall tree, you cut the top off, you build a structure to get up on top of there, and you basically cut it at an angle. I'll leave it at that. You can figure out the rest. And so this is not going to take that long to build. I think so often when we think of the gallows, we think of it in terms of the Wild West, where someone was hung from a gallows. It's not a structure like that. It's basically a tall tree that they cut down and trim to accomplish their purpose. So in terms of that, he knows, I'm going to build this structure. I'm going to get this set up. I'm going to make sure Mordecai's on it. So now you imagine Haman going to bed waking up the next morning, he's about ready to run out. He's whistling. He's got a spring in his step. He's going to take care of this guy who will not bow to him and just annoys him. And he's going to manipulate the king to make this happen. And then he's going to go to a feast and he's going to be the greatest guy in the empire. So he gets rid of a problem, goes to a great meal, and everyone's going to know how prestigious he is, right? So you have to understand, this is his mindset. Now, he has that advice from his wife, and we're looking at what's going to happen when Haman comes to the king the next morning. The setting of this chapter is a setting where the king has a difficult night. We might say, well, why does that matter? Well, in the providence of God, at a moment when Mordecai the Jew, descendant of Judah, one of the Judahites, is going to be destroyed, the king can't sleep. And the king knows how to go to sleep, right? I always say, anyway, I won't make the joke, but king figures out how he goes to sleep. And he goes to sleep by having the Chronicles of the Kingdom read to him. So if there's anything that can put anyone to sleep, this is probably the thing. You just have a guy read the text to you, go through the decrees of the kingdom, and eventually you'll just drift off to sleep and the guy will leave you alone. But that doesn't happen. As he's reading the Chronicles of the Kingdom, or the records of the kingdom, he hears of something that happened. There's a guy named Mordecai, and we don't know at this point if he knows Mordecai is a Jew. We find out that he knows Mordecai is a Jew. So clearly he knows that in 11 months, this guy is going to be exterminated anyway. So it's kind of important to understand the king's not as dumb as we think he is, or at least as it's presented in the text. And here's this Mordecai, and Mordecai foils this plan of these men who are going to kill the king, some of the eunuchs. And so the king thinks, my goodness, I remember that now. Have we done anything for this guy? Because again, remember we mentioned when this plan came to fruition and Mordecai reported it, he told Esther, Esther gave credit to Mordecai. And we said that, Mordecai is probably basically like a secret service agent who would be sort of just like blending in with the people, which is why he's at the king's gate. And he would know multiple languages. And so he would know these individuals who are plotting. And so he's doing his job of reporting this to the king. Now it's important because when we understand that the king knows he's a Jew, this is putting a hole in Haman's story, isn't it? Remember Haman said, there's people here. They do not follow the decrees of this kingdom. They're a rule unto themselves. They're a bunch of mavericks. Then now you can understand that this king is not so dumb, right? It's kind of cartoony how this story is communicated to us. And I don't mean that in a sense of deprecating the word of God, but the way the narrative is written, it's purposely written to show us the silliness of Persia and all their arrogance and splendor compared to the decrees of God, right? So the Lord is the one who is the ultimate authority. Persia is trying to claim that they're heaven on earth, much like a Babylon. So it's important to understand that paradigm as well. So this king, understanding that Mordecai the Jew, if Haman's correct, that these Jews are people that don't like Persia, well, then why would Mordecai report a problem to the queen regarding his assassination? If you want to take over the kingdom, you get in with the guys who are in that plot and you kill the king and you put your guy in power. And so the king's probably beginning to reason, wait a minute. If Haman's right that these people are ruleless and they don't want to abide by the rules, why would he protect my life? And why wouldn't he engage in another conspiracy after I failed to reward this guy? Because that's the other thing in Persia. If you save a king's life, that the reward is over the top. And so it's very beneficial for you to betray any attempt to assassinate the king. So if the king hasn't done this, and Mordecai was doing it for the reward, and the king hasn't rewarded him, Well, if these Jews are so ruthless and they're individuals that will not live by the rules, why isn't Mordecai acted up? And so the king, not sleeping, hearing about this, saying, wait a minute, we've never rewarded this man? This man should receive some compensation. What are we thinking? This is what we do. And so the providential problem is it's not solved by the majesty of a burning bush. It's not solved through a talking donkey, as we see with the prophet Balaam. It's not solved through 10 plagues. The Lord is just saying, look at how powerful I am. I can accomplish my purpose and put my plan in motion just by giving a king insomnia for one night. And when he tries to bore himself to sleep, he actually is called to action. Now, this is the reality of that providence. God is at work. Now, the funny thing is, we have Haman now entering the court. As I mentioned, with the Persian kings, you would have roughly 5-7 people or so who could basically approach the king at any time. There's an exception. If the king is occupied with one of the occupants of the harem, that would be the only exception. Other than that, these individuals could interrupt the king at any moment. And that's why you notice that when the king doesn't extend his scepter, that this Haman is certainly one of those people, right? Because we see that even with Esther, he has to extend his scepter and she's able to talk. So when the king is inquiring of the eunuch, this is kind of a scary moment, saying, hey, who's in my inner court? Because this means that somebody's interrupting the king. And if this isn't someone who's in the inner court, that person may be about to lose their head, literally. And so the king, hey, I want to sleep. I don't want to be interrupted. I'm trying to figure out how to reward this man. I don't want somebody bothering me right now. They say it's Haman. He goes, oh, well, invite him in. Now, this is the hilarious thing. Because we go back to Haman leaving that meeting with his wife and with his friends who have advised him, build the big gallows or the big pole, make sure that you ask the king to put Mordecai upon it and get this done in the morning, then go to the banquet. So you picture Haman walking into this thing, springing his step, whistling over to the king's palace. I'm like number 2 in the kingdom. I mean, I am incredible. And so the king says, hey, come in. So Haman walks in, doesn't get his head lopped off. And the king says, hey, I got an idea for you, or I want to hear some input from you. What do I do for a guy I really want to honor? Well, what is Haman to think? I had a feast with Esther and the king. I'm having another feast with Esther and the king. I mean, who else is the king going to want to honor? It's going to be me. King's being subtle. I'll try and be subtle and coy. So I'm going to just kind of lay out some things. And the funny thing is, if you notice Haman and Mordecai seems kind of high, but not as high as Haman. So the expectation is probably Mordecai is going to be the guy leading Haman around, making the announcement. And you can see Haman saying, finally, King Amalek is receiving the glory he deserves. And that silly descendant of Saul, well, he's the one who's serving me. So you can understand from what we've seen in the book, sort of the way Haman works. And I don't think this is really all that speculative or really stretching the narrative all that much, because he himself says, who else would the king desire to honor but me? Which is a rather funny thing. It tells you certainly how pride can cloud our judgment. But as he says this, and he enters into the presence of the king, one who has made a decree, has basically pressed it in with the king's signet ring, so he's put it into action. And then as the king asks him, he says, well, I know what we should do. I know what we'll do. We'll take royal robes. Now, the royal robes of the king that the king has worn, notice it's not just royal robes that are prepared, but royal robes that the king has worn. The thinking of this is that the kings were somewhat divine, and so they were kind of like demigods to basically potentially gods, which is where Haman seems to be viewing himself and why he wants people to bow to him. It seems like it's more than just reverence and respect, that Haman kind of sees himself as part of like the divine demigod sort of class. I mean, that seems to be the implication of it. And so when you have the king's royal robes that the king has worn, the thought is that the king is going to garnish you in his garment and he's going to confer some power to you. That the garment themselves would take the God sort of power or the demigod power, however you want to word it, from the king, capture it in the garment, and then when the garment's placed on you, you're clothed in the power of that demigod. So that's why he's emphasizing the robe that the king has worn. That's the first thing. Secondly, he says, let's take the horse that's basically the royal horse, and we'll put a crown on it. Now, some people say, well, this is just in line with the cartoony nature of the book. Well, it's really not, because historically we can find that the king's horses or significant figures would have a horse that would have some sort of a garnish on its head, maybe not necessarily a crown, but it would be a designation that the horse is unique, right? I mean, we can think of this where you think of ambassadors, you think of the president having a particular mode of transportation, right? You know, that's not just a car, that's the president's car, right? And that's sort of the thought of the horse. This isn't just a horse. This is a king's horse. And so the horse is dressed and garnished appropriately. And they're going to put royal robes on the horse over the top. And he says, okay, and then I want somebody to lead this individual around and say, behold, here is the man that the king desires to honor. And it's really funny, because the presentation is he wants this herald leading the horse around, like exclaiming this, shouting it. So the whole city of Susa will spend a day looking at this man saying, wow, here is a man that our king, who is a demigod or god, depending how they would view him, however high they would see him, really exalts. This man has to be special. We should honor him. And so you imagine that the king kind of pauses for a moment. And he says, you know what? That's a great idea. Don't leave anything out. Now go find Mordecai the Jew and go do that for him. I mean, can you imagine how Haman's face just fell? His whole plan was, this is what he's going to receive. Mordecai is going to be the guy leading him around. And now Haman has to be the guy, because what he said in the king's presence and how he sold this, that when he proclaims, here is the man that the king desires to honor, he can't whisper it. He can't say, here's a guy the king desires to honor. I mean, he has to proclaim it. And he has to lead him around as a guy who wrote the decree to kill the Jews. I mean, the irony here is where it's sort of the imagery of God up in heaven when the Babelites are building their tower and the Lord has to come down from his throne and the Lord has to look upon it, right? Everything up to that moment, they're building a great tower. It's going to penetrate into heaven. And it's sort of like the Lord just notices a couple of ants busy and he has to squint to see this majestic structure. Now, it's not that God's clueless about these things, but the intention of the narrative in this sort of way is to communicate what man thinks is so big and majestic is nothing in comparison to God. And so it is the same thing here, that the Lord is sending a message to the serpent seed. Yeah, you thought you triumphed, didn't you? You thought you had my hand tied at Persia, but look what I'm doing. I'm going to dress the king of my people, right? The first king that the people wanted, in royal robes. And he's going to be led around as the Jew, not as Saul, but as the Jew, right? So Jews, descendants of Judah. In other words, you're going to have Amalek, the man that I said his line will be exterminated. That is my word. He's going to be proclaiming the Jews' ultimate dominance. In other words, the Messiah is going to triumph, and your man's going to proclaim it there, Satan. So let's see how this plays out. And so, like I said, Haman understands you do not mess with the king. As he sold this idea, he has to proclaim it as loud as he can. He has to run around all of Susa and say, this is the man that the Lord or that the king desires to honor. This is the man. And Haman, the one who wrote the decree to kill the Jews, wants to exalt Mordecai, but he wants to exalt him in his humiliation and his execution, is the one who is ironically exalting him before the city, and Mordecai is very much alive. The Jew, the messianic line, the line of Judah, thrives. And so this event transpires. And as this event transpires, you find two reactions. Mordecai, like I guess all of us, we see the humanness. We kind of go up and we see the divine, we see the providence of God, we see the working of God, the irony of God, the humor of God, and now we're brought back to the humanness of it. Mordecai basically goes back to the gate. This doesn't go to his head. He recognizes there's still a timetable. Just because Haman did this doesn't mean we're out of it at this point. And so instead of thinking, wow, maybe God really is working, there's nothing about him going home to his family, finding peace, or relaxing with his family, or even celebrating this moment. He's one who simply goes back to the gate, back to his post, wondering what his fate is basically the implication of it. I'm just going to go back to my life. I really hope we get out of this. And you kind of look at it as a reader and say, really, you don't think you're out of this at this point, Mordecai? Seems like the Lord has already sort of turned the tables a little bit and is giving you some hope here. But it is a reminder. What do? Well, so often we fail to see the Lord's protective hand, his power, his care, and we get locked into our mindset. We get locked into the way we're thinking rather than thinking, no, God is a good and gracious, merciful God, and he is one who is at work. And we need to believe that. We need to proceed in that confidence. But what becomes something else as a contrast? Mordecai goes back to his work. We find that Haman is all of a sudden in a horrible situation. Because as Mordecai returns to his post, we find that it's Haman who hurries. Now, the language here is language that echoes the decrees. And so I'd argue that thematically, the book of Esther is inviting us to think about these decrees. There was an urgency with these decrees being hurried, with these decrees being in people's languages, the languages of the kingdom. Everyone would receive it. And so Haman, like the decree, hurries himself back to his house. And so there's something of urgency here. And he calls his wife and he calls his advisors. Now, I don't know about you, but they already gave him a plan. Obviously, he's realized that now would not be the appropriate time to say, hey, you know that guy that foiled the plot that I just paraded around the city? How about we execute him pretty quick? You good with that? Like, I think Haman realizes that's not going to go over so well. Especially considering that Mordecai saved the king's life. He's still second in command at best. He's not the king. So he calls his family, or he calls his wife and he calls his friends together. And you can imagine the expectation is, okay, I got this feast with Esther and the king. How do I work this into the conversation, right? That's sort of the expectation we would have. How do I make this happen still? Because clearly this is what needs to happen. So you can see as Mordecai is locked into his way of thinking, so we see Haman is still locked in with his way of thinking. This is what must really happen. And so as he calls them together, we don't have the details as to how he recounts this. In a previous narrative, we heard Haman's recounting to the point where it was fatiguing us. about how majestic this man is. Now it's just simply a summary statement. He told them everything that happened. In other words, you know that plan that you gave me? Yeah, that didn't work. It kind of flipped. So what's our next plan? And you would think that these people would give him some wisdom. And again, it's really funny when you think back to the decrees, isn't it? Because as he hurries home, you think of the decrees. Here's Haman hurrying home, basically saying, yeah, you know what we decreed, that women shouldn't tell us what to do? I want my wife to tell me what to do now. I mean, there is just so much irony and hilarity in this narrative that it's just hard not to bust up. And so here he is, waiting for his wife, waiting for the messengers or his advisors and friends to tell him what to do. These are the wise men. Well, you find they turn on him, much like Balaam turns on King Balak. Balak hired him to prophesy against the Jews because whenever Balaam would speak, he could twist the will of God. Well, Balak found out that doesn't work in every situation and not for every God. And so unfortunately, his wife and the advisors turn to him and say, listen, if Mordecai the Jew is one that's rising above you and you're beginning to fall before him, you will not prevail. The bravado and confidence they had that we will win, we will overcome, we will figure this out has fallen away. And basically what they're telling Haman at this point, this is where you understand your fate. And you're not going to gain dominance. And so this is one of those moments where you either bow your knee to the living God and you say, I was wrong. I'm in a position of the Amalekites. I'm one who's in rebellion against you. And much like Amalek, you think he would study history. When Saul failed to do what he had to do, and Amalek meets with Samuel, he sprints out there. He's excited. He's happy. And Samuel says, you don't get to live. That's not what the Lord's decreed. And if the guy thinks that Samuel's going to bless him and Samuel executes him and Saul's removed as king. And you would think that Haman would understand that this precedent is not a prophet's preference. The prophet is doing what God has commanded him to do. And so when the Lord says the seed of the serpent will not prevail, this is not an optional decree. There is no going back. God is not like the king of Persia. Oh, Vashti stood up to me. Send her away. Next day, man, I really miss Vashti. And everyone's like, oh, he's going to take her back because he's unstable. That's not God. God makes a decree and it stands. And now his wife and the advisors are turning to Haman and saying, listen, your line is not going to prevail. The messianic line, the line of Judah, is going to prevail. You are going to fall before him. In other words, if you're smart, this is where you bow your knee, you turn to Christ, and you repent, and you turn from your plan, because you will not prevail. The narrative ends on this chilling note, that while they're warning him of this reality and giving this prophetic warning, you will be like your ancestors. As the Lord has decreed, you will face their fate. And before he can even process it or ask them another question, the eunuchs knock on the door. And they say it's time for the king's banquet with Esther. And it leaves us in this wonderful cliffhanger in the narrative. And the book of Esther, I'd argue, is just this very well-written piece that has sort of a cartoony exaggeration of the characteristics of people in the land, sort of as a satire against Persia. But it's not just to make us laugh. It's also to make us contemplate the providence of God. I mean, God's people are on the verge of being exterminated. God's plans are on the verge of being stamped out. And the Lord actually allows us to laugh in the midst of it. And so when we ask that question at the beginning, how is Esther going to prevail? Well, it's not Esther who's going to prevail. The Lord's using Esther, no doubt. Mordecai did say that in his sharpest moment in perception of God's providence. Maybe it's for such a moment as this, right? That he reminds Esther. But it's not Esther. And it's not a talking donkey like in the Balaam story. There's a wonderful message that Balaam had to learn from the donkey, ultimately that the word of the Lord stands. It's not through the burning bush that captures Moses' attention. It's not through 10 radical plagues. It's not through walking through the Red Sea and all these majestic things God has done. He sets his plan in motion in the very silence. As the king is silent, so the Lord is silent, but actively working. It's just a sleepless night. It's just a king once again trying to meet a very basic human desire of wanting to sleep. And this event is called to his attention. And the reality is, this book, even as God is silent, reminds us that God can work through radical ways, as we've seen in covenant history, even as we read in Acts of healing a man. And the Lord can work in very ordinary ways that become so ordinary that Mordecai misses the significance. Haman misses the significance, fails to understand that there is a God who has set his decree and stated his decree and will carry out that decree. And as he has proclaimed that the seed of the serpent will not stand, pictured in Amalek, where he thinks he's prevailed, he doesn't prevail. So Haman thinks he's going to prevail and exterminate all the people associated with Judah or the Jews or the messianic line. He's not going to prevail. In fact, the Lord is going to do a radical reversal. And he actually does a gracious thing by allowing Haman to parade Mordecai around. There's an opportunity right there, isn't there, for Haman to fall to his knee and recognize he's not going to prevail. The seed of the serpent will not win, but the God of heaven is the ultimate victor. So again, just a wonderful reminder of how the Lord works in the most mundane, everyday details, and how the Lord works in his providence in the silence of this book, and yet he is so active, reminding us that the decrees of this world do not stand, but the decrees of heaven come to pass. And how much more assured ought we to be now that we look to the resurrected Christ, the ascended Christ, who has overcome. Let us bow our knee to our living Savior and recognize that our life is only in him. He will see us and shepherd us to the very place where he wants us to go. Let us walk in him and let us find our life and joy in him. Amen. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We're Belgrade URC, a Reformed Bible-believing church in the Gallatin Valley in Belgrade, Montana. We meet Sundays at 10 a.m. and 6 p.m., and we love to see you worshiping and fellowshipping with us each Sunday. Learn more about our church at belgradeurc.com, where you can subscribe to our podcasts and use our sermon archive. Until we meet again, may the Lord's blessing and peace be upon you.